It's like we need to make business decisions, and we need numbers to make business decisions, and we need our numbers to reflect actual business realities. And there's a process to think through what's happening in a business to be able to put that in numbers, to create a framework that we can use to make valuable business decisions. And that's kind of what I tend to focus on. I care a little bit less. I care more about the analysis that we use a model and more the artifact of a model itself. But I do tend to think about the actual kind of model structure as well. So core learning objectives today: go through, understand how down rounds impact founders and investors, go through the key anti-dilution concepts and terms, and a couple of examples of how I've actually seen the documents, go through the math and how documents turn into and terms turn into math, and then leave with a practical example in a worksheet. And if you haven't seen it yet, I put the link in the chat, foresight.is/dilution. That takes you to a Google Drive. You can download this PDF as well as the spreadsheet we're going to use today. So first, a disclaimer: nothing here is financial or legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, not a financial advisor, not offering either of the two here. Always work with qualified investment professionals when you're working with on actual transactions. And then as a general note, this is a 30-minute workshop. So, there's no way for me to go into prior knowledge around like what a cap table is, how financing structures work for taking in money for equity or convertibles, or how to actually use that as well. That's anything outside of today. And even some of the anti-dilution stuff I can't get into in a short session today. But I'm gonna try to cover the most important things for anti-dilution. For other things, there's a lot of other things that I've done for that. So one is foresight.is/cap-tables that has a bunch of different posts as well as links to classes and templates that I kind of provided around cap tables. I'm repost the link real fast. Yep. So I also do teach a class on this. So I've taught this comprehensive master class in the past, like a 6-session master class, and I go over all the past topics like cap tables and waterfalls and all that. I don't have one of those scheduled until the fall, but I do have 2 smaller workshops. The next one is just focused on cap tables and convertibles and that structure. And that's in, I think, next week, actually. But a lot of what we're doing today is also contained within a tool that I've created and kind of evolved over time, called a cap table and Excel waterfall tool. This is free to download. You can donate, but it's free to download. That builds out structures to build cap tables as well as waterfalls. Now, that's just one way to build it. I always say like there's many, many, many different ways in terms of which we can build out cap tables, we can build out waterfalls, build out structures, many different ways to do that. And what I try to focus on is first principles, and all kind of teachings and things around this is first principles. How do we understand what's actually happening so that we can adjust what we're doing for any individual situation? Now, anti-dilution or dilution is a scary topic. When people think about dilution, like getting diluted is one of these things that founders don't want to have, investors don't want to get. They don't get diluted. So let's talk about what that means. So dilution refers to most commonly the fact that your ownership, the specific ownership you have in a company, decreases when there's a new funding round. So you own a certain percentage of the company, and that decreased after the company raised money. Now, that kind of dilution is normal, right? When companies raise new capital, they bring in new money and they issue new shares to them. Issuing new shares means you increase the total number of shares. And if you hold the same number of shares, then you're going to get diluted down. You're going to own a smaller ownership percentage of the company. And that's totally normal. And actually, if the share price for those shares is going up over time, that's fine, right? Because the value of your investment's going up. Now, the problem was we come into this concept called a down round, which basically just means when the company raises money at a lower valuation, and specifically when it raises money at pre-money valuation that's lower than a post-money valuation of a previous round. And what that means is that this investor who thought they had a certain number of shares, which was worth a certain amount of money, now it's not. It's worth something less than that. And that could be very damaging. It could be damaging from the perspective of founders and investors for morale, psyche, and as we'll go through the terms, we'll see it can be very, very damaging from a ownership perspective, specifically to investors, but also to founders. So let's talk about what anti-dilution is. So anti-dilution refers to the various provisions in shareholder agreements that provide protection from these two types of dilution. So ownership dilution refers to when the ownership, equity ownership decreases as a percentage. So if you own a certain percentage of total equity, after a financing round, now you have a smaller ownership percentage. And that can come from issuing new equity or new shares, new options, warrants, and other structures. And commonly, the common protection against that is rights of first offer or preemptive rights, pro rata rights. That provides protection from ownership dilution in more common scenarios. Other type of dilution is value dilution. Value dilution refers to the value of an investor's equity goes down over time. So you invested a certain amount of money to get a certain number of shares, is worth a certain amount of money, and then the company raised money at lower valuation, and now your investment is no longer worth that, it's worth something less. And that occurs when the company issues new equity shares, when you issue at a pre-money valuation lower than the post-money valuation of a prior round. And that's when anti-dilution protections are intended to provide protection from value dilution. Now, there's a lot of different ways in which this can be written in legal documents. And I took these from a couple of different examples from the web, the link at the bottom there. But there's many different ways in which this can be written. And it points to different ways in which, one, there are protections against dilution from these two different types of dilution, but also in terms of the different ways in which we deal with it and the different ways in which we calculate it. And we'll go into the various permutations of all of them in a second. But here's a couple of examples of a couple of different terms. First one says, hey, companies shall issue additional common shares, pro rata, such that ownership goes down. Now that is a type where they're maintaining the full ownership percentage by issuing new shares to the investor. The one at the bottom there is a weighted average anti-dilution, which is actually a pretty normal one. That talks about, hey, if a company issues new financing, and it creates this formula at the end. And what that's referring to is when there's to address anti-dilution protections to address value dilution. And it tells you that we're going to adjust the conversion ratio. Well, this one actually, wait, so this one says, so this one's what issue new number of shares, so issue new shares, and then provides a way to calculate it. The various ways in which we have anti-dilution protections and the various ways that they can address, be implemented, and then be calculated point to the fact that it's very important to read the shareholder agreements. There's many different ways you've written. Always important to be able to read and interpret the legal documents to understand how this actually kind of works in practice. Now, here's a simple example that we're going to use a little bit here, but more so we actually get in a spreadsheet. Say an investor purchased 2.5 million preferred shares, you pay $1 per share, and you own 20% of the company. And the company raises new round at 8 million pre-money. What happens? Well, in this case, we have two different types of dilution coming in, right? So we have ownership dilution. So you own 20% in the company. Now the company's issuing more shares, and now you won't own 20%. You also have value dilution because previously you purchased shares at a 10 million pre, and now they're being, now their company's raising money at a 8 million pre, so less than the post money in the previous round. So you have these two different types of dilutions happening. Now, ownership dilution, oftentimes we do is you have issue new shares to the investor. Now, sometimes the documents can be written so that they're free, right? The company will just issue new shares to the investor or the shareholder such that they maintain the ownership percentage. That's that first clause after that example is a couple of slides back. It can be also be written way we issue new shares to the investor, but you have to pay for them. And that's what we call like right of first refusal, pro rata rights, or preemptive rights, basically, in different ways to kind of term it. And that basically allows the investor the right to participate in a new financing. So like, hey, you own 20% of the company raises a new round. Well, you can purchase a 20% of the new shares being issued to the investor as part of the round to maintain the ownership percentage. And that's what we call this like right of first refusal or pro rata rights. Now, there are carve-outs or exclusions to pro rata rights. So like if the company issues new shares to an investor, but also expands the option pool or creates an option pool, pro rata rights or rights of first refusal, they don't provide protection against expanding options or options. So like your ownership can actually go down, but it won't go down as a percentage of the equity that's issued to the investors. So you can do this two ways, right? Issue new shares, either give them to them for free or make them pay for it. Now, value dilution, most typically what you do is you adjust the conversion ratio of preferred to common. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. And sometimes you'll see structures where they actually just issue new shares to investors. And oftentimes this is called this thing called like price-based anti-dilution adjustments. And what this means, this adjusts the conversion price for preferred shares to convert into a common share. And what this means basically is when you own preferred shares, one of the fundamental underlying rights behind them is you have the right in the event of an exit to choose to keep your preferred shares and take whatever the proceeds are to those preferred shares based on whatever those terms are, or convert those preferred shares to common shares and share along all the common shareholders, take what you get as a common shareholder. Now, investors will basically choose which one actually makes them most money. Now, most typically, one preferred share converts to one common share, but not always. Agreements can be written differently, so like one share preferred converts to 2 shares of common. And specifically, if there has been a price-based anti-dilution adjustment, they've adjusted the conversion ratio. If you had anti-dilution basically kicking around, then one share preferred won't convert to one share common, it might convert to 1.8 or whatever the calculation is based upon. We'll go through the ways to calculate it. So this is the idea of adjusting the conversion ratio. Now, adjusting the conversion ratio doesn't mean you actually issue new shares. It doesn't actually change the actual share count, but it does say on a fully diluted as converted basis, like if everything was fully converted, then you actually would get more shares for that. This will make a lot more sense once we actually see the implementation in spreadsheets. You also can have this happen with issuing new shares. Right? I have seen the structures where you'll adjust the value dilution by issuing new shares. There's a couple parts to this, adjusting the conversion ratio doesn't change the ownership, doesn't change the voting or governance rights around a company because people still own the same number of shares, but they have a different economic rights associated with their investment. You issue new shares, those shares can come with additional voting or governance control unless it's like specifically outlined otherwise. So there can be different implementations in terms of how it changes out governance or voting rights associated with them. So there are pluses and minuses and pros and cons of both approaches. And I always say always work with a qualified, experienced transaction lawyer who is familiar with these types of financings when you structure these agreements or agree to these as part of shareholder agreements. But there are different ways in which it can be structured, and I've seen innumerable different examples of all of this. Now, we have this concept of value ownership dilution and the ways to address it, and value dilution and the ways to address it. And we have 2 different ways to basically address that by either adjusting conversion ratio or issuing new shares. There's an additional layer to this, which basically says, okay, well, how do we calculate the impact of it? How do we actually calculate how many new shares, or how do we calculate the adjustment of conversion ratio? And there's a few different ways to do this. One is this concept called a full ratchet. And a full ratchet basically says, hey, we're going to adjust all your past shares so that they basically get the same price as the new shares. So if you paid $2 per share for the past, we're going to do our calculations so that now, all those shares you bought for $2, we're going to either adjust the conversion ratio or issue new shares to adjust for the fact that you would actually maybe purchase shares at $1. Weighted average is a little bit different. And what this effectively does is it provides, so that full ratchet provides full protection to investors. Weighted average provides some protection to investors. And the way that it provides it is basically based on this formula that we use. It's basically say, hey, you're going to get some credit for the additional ones, but not entirely. Now, unfortunately, even more confusing, there's even 2 different ways to calculate weighted average: broad-based weighted average and narrow-based weighted average. And the difference basically is, whether you include options or warrants in them. Unfortunately, it gets kind of complicated when you actually want to do this. Now, we'll go through the actual, the formulas itself. What I would say, remembering the formulas is really hard. I don't try to remember the formulas. What I always say is, if you're always reading the documents surrounding an agreement, the good part is documents always specify exactly how to do this. They'll have a clause which says, hey, here's how you calculate anti-dilution protection. They'll have that formula, that CP1, CP2, whatever. You can always just take it directly out of the documents. So the good thing is if you have legal documents around it, you can just read the documents and implement the formula as it's constructed in there. And, typically, if you have this long calculation like broad-based weighted average, it's a whole page which details out how to calculate it. So you don't have to remember it, but I will provide the spreadsheet do have an example in terms of how the formula works. So the way to think about this is there's like a generic formula. The generic formula says, hey, like when you're calculating a conversion ratio. So generic formula says a new conversion ratio, basically the original equity issue price divided by the new conversion price. When it's a full ratchet, it's pretty easy. The new conversion price is just the new equity issue price. When you have weighted average, it gets a little more complicated. And instead of, I'll go through the formula spreadsheet, but the basic idea behind this is that basically you want to like reprice it as if some of the protection from the previous round. That's why you have this formula which says, hey, the new conversion price is the original conversion price times this thing, something plus something divided by something plus something. And it's basically the difference is number of shares you would have gotten in the new round using the prior price and the number of shares issued in the new round at the new price. And that's a factor of a difference we use to calculate out what the actual average weighted protection is. But rather than go through the formula in theory, I think it's a lot more valuable to go through it in practice. So I'm going to go through the actual spreadsheet here and open it up. Now, this is available at the link I shared earlier. Now, this has a bunch of other stuff in it. So there's a README sheet, which links into other resources around cap tables and other good things to read on the web that have been created to help you understand anti-dilution protection. And then each of these spreadsheets, the intent is to take you through these different examples we discussed. The first one, it just says, hey, here's what happens. You have a down round. Well, actually, wait, hold on. Let me make sure that people can edit this. I'm going to change the rights to editor rights. So this way you can actually see the formulas. Please don't change anything. You have full access to change it, but it's helpful for you if you actually open up the Google Sheet, you can see the formulas. Please don't actually change anything. So this example is down round, basically shows what happens if there's a down round. So going back to the example we shared in the slides before, if the investor bought 2.5 million shares at a 10 million pre, paid $1 per share, they own 20% of the company, and the value of their investment is $2.5 million. So the example where a new investor comes in and invests $2.5 million, but pays 8 million pre. So we do the calculations to figure out, okay, well, what's the new share price that this investor is paying, and what happens to the existing investor? And that's kind of what this thing highlights. It says, hey, before they own 20%, now they own 15%, and their investment went from 2.5 million to 1.6 million. And the founder also got massively diluted from it as well. Now, let's go through a couple of examples of ways to address that. So the first one here is around ownership dilution. So this pre-financing cap table is exactly the same structure. What we're changing here is what we're dealing with is the pro forma cap table or forecasted cap table to show the impact of the round. Now, what we were implementing here is the idea of like ownership dilution and simply just issuing new shares to the investors such that they maintain the same ownership percentage. So what we've done basically is said, hey, we've calculated out this number of shares, right? So I said, hey, how many new shares do we need to issue? And what I basically said, hey, we need to own a certain percentage of the new shares being issued. So we said, hey, in this example, it's how many new shares being issued to the new investor plus how many new shares being issued to the existing investor times this algebraic formula. Basically, I don't want to focus on the algebraic part, but what I basically want to point to is the fact that we're figuring out how many new shares do we need to issue to this investor such that they maintain the same 20% ownership percentage. Now, two things important caveats to note about this. Remember that this new investor coming in is not going to get diluted by the new shares being issued to the existing investor. So we have to include those shares when we calculate the share price that the existing investor pays, and the new investor pays, I'm sorry. And what you'll see basically is these calculations means that the ownership percentage is maintained. So they own 20% before, they own 20% now, but the value of the investment still goes down. Right? Their value of the investment was 2.5 million before. Now afterwards, it's only 2.1 million, and that's normal. You could do this same structure. This is where we're giving them the shares for free. You could do the exact same thing to figure out the pro rata rights for the investor if they had to purchase the shares and do it as part of that. I cover pro rata rights in some of the other cap table classes, but what I want to focus on here is just showing how we just issue new shares against that. Now, the other example here is we have not ownership dilution, but value dilution. And so the couple of example sheets here go through different ways to calculate value dilution, right? So full ratchet, broad-based, and narrow-based, and both adjusted conversion ratio as well as issuing new shares. So this sheet basically goes in to say, okay, the same pre-financing cap table, but let's look at a post-financing cap table. And we basically laid out here is we're going to, this is an example of adjusting the conversion ratio. So before here we have, 12.5 million shares, all the conversion ratios are 1. So the fully diluted shares on an as converted basis is the same 12.5. But in this case, once we adjust the conversion ratio, that's going to change a bit of how this works. So this new investor is coming in and purchase new shares, but invest 2.5
Hey, how's it going? I have a bunch of stuff here.
Sorry, can people mute themselves? So thank you. So what we have here is if there's no anti-dilution protection, as example, they would have got massively the company, and their value of their investment got down significantly as well. The key here is this part on the anti-dilution protection. Sorry, can whoever's talking please mute themselves? Thank you. So the original, here's the implementation of the formula. It's right here in this full ratchet anti-dilution protection. And what we have here is this original issue purchase price. That's that $1. The original investor, they paid $1 per share. And the new purchase price, that's the price per share the new investor is paying as part of the round. And that comes from the share price calculations around the round. The original conversion price was 1, right? Or original conversion ratio, I think, actually. So the new conversion is actually the original conversion ratio, I apologize. So the new conversion ratio, this is the important part of this formula. It says, hey, original conversion ratio times original issue purchase price divided by new purchase price. So we calculate as 1.8. And what that means is that is the new conversion ratio that adjusts the ownership of the company such that it maintains the value of their investment. So if we said, okay, we 1.82 conversion ratio, we time that times the 2.5 million preferred shares. That means on a fully as converted basis, they would have 4.5 million fully diluted shares. That number of shares times the new share price equals the value of investment, right? So we maintain the value of the investment. Interestingly, the ownership percentage has gone up, right? So instead of only owning 20% of the company after the anti-dilution protections, now they own 23%, 23.8. The impact of that is borne by founders. The new investors, they agree to the price they're coming in at. They get the ownership that they agreed to as part of the round. The impact of the solution is borne by founders. That's an important aspect of this. When you talk about how down rounds impact cap tables, it's a bad thing. It hurts investors, it hurts shareholders, it hurts founders, but it particularly hurts founders because they're the ones, if you have anti-dilution protections, they're commonly not going to have that. So they're going to bear the brunt of the dilution associated with that. So their ownership percentage is the one that really gets hit. In this example, they owned, prior to the round, they owned 80%. Now they got diluted by issuing new equity, which is normal to them, but they got additional dilution from the anti-dilution protection of the existing investors. So with the full anti-dilution protections, they go down to only a 52% ownership percentage. So it's very damaging to their ownership percentage to have to basically give new shares to both new investors, but it's also existing investors at kind of this lower price. Now, this is an example of how to do it by adjusting conversion ratio. You could do the exact same thing if you're issuing new shares instead. Exact same structure works. Exact same formula works. We're still doing the same thing to figure out the same thing, the conversion ratio. The only difference is that we're just issuing new shares. So instead of before, the number of the actual share counts for issued outstanding share counts, it didn't change, but we adjusted the conversion ratio. In this example, we're not adjusting the conversion ratio, but the number of shares actually changed because we're actually issuing new shares, but the structure is the same. Go through the same process, calculate out the same conversion ratio. And in this case, we're just taking the number of shares they have times the the new conversion ratio, and that's the number of shares they have to have at the end of the round. And we do the same calculations to figure out how many new shares are being issued as part of it to make sure we use that. We're calculating the share price that the new investor pays. The last example I want to go through before I kind of break for questions is an example of broad-based weighted average. Same exact structure, right? Pre-financing cap table, post-financing cap table, same exact structure. Here's an example going through a conversion ratio. The difference here is the formula is a little more complicated, right? So the formula, same idea, the original issue purchase price, original conversion ratio, new purchase price. But we have this more complicated implementation of the formula. We figure out this new conversion price. And that's where we're saying it's, R25, which is the original conversion ratio, times this factor. So R31 is fully diluted shares per the round, plus the number of shares that you would have been issued in the new round using the prior conversion price, right? So 2.5 million divided by the previous purchase price. The number of shares issued in the new round and the new equity price, so 3.9. So we take the new conversion price we're calculating basically says 1 + 1 divided by 1 + the other. And that calculates the new conversion price for that. We do the new conversion ratio. It's just the original conversion ratio divided by the new conversion price. And that calculates out this new conversion ratio. Now, so the way it implements in the model is the same, right? So in the full ratchet scenario, our conversion ratio is 1.8, and the ratio here is 1.1. What that points to is there's way less anti-dilution protection, way less anti-dilution protection associated with this, which is one of the aspects to broad-based weighted average. Same thing happens with narrow-based weighted average, just a slightly different calculation in terms of how we do calculate fully diluted shares per round. The exact same thing can be used if we're using new shares, right? Just the same way to the full ratchet example. We're going through this process to calculate this conversion ratio, and number of shares don't change, but we're using the conversion ratio to deal with the fully diluted shares. The exact same thing for broad-based weighted average, except in this case, we're actually just issuing new shares and not changing the conversion ratio for this. I know that this is hard to go through in any short period of time. And so my advice to you is to take some time with the sheet, download to Excel, copy to Google Drive, and go through the implementation of the formulas in the different examples to, one, see the different impact of adjusting the conversion ratio or issuing new shares, and then also go through the different ways to calculate it. Full ratchet, broad-based weighted anti-dilution, narrow-based weighted average anti-dilution, and to see how it is different for both ownership dilution and then value dilution. So multiple different layers of what dilution is and how you calculate it and what it addresses. And it's taken me a long time to internalize and find a way to communicate this. And so I know that this is hard to fully understand in a short session. And so what I always say to people is, one, feel free to use me as a resource for this. I work with people on this, calculating this stuff out or dealing with or understanding how to do it all the time, both from actually working in an actual transaction side to just general education. So feel free to use me as a resource as you go through the materials here that talks about this. So my guess is a lot of people will probably rewatch the recording again to go through it, and that's fully recommended and fully understood. But I hope this is a good introduction to anti-dilution and how the math works and how the different clauses are implemented. So I want to open up to questions that people have kind of around any of this. There's a question here. Let's see if I can read it. I'm conflicted with the anti-dilution protections aimed to preserve ownership of existing investors. As I understand it, this approach is not arithmetically feasible as the new investor is purchasing all sources of equity, but this is an independent variable as pre-money value is determined. It is feasible, totally feasible. Totally possible. Let's see. So blah blah. There's some math here. The feasible just to preserve monetary value investor A. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. But it is fully feasible to do it this way. One thing to remember is that there's also multiple different ways to calculate this. Sometimes you use algebra, sometimes you use circular reference for this. Sometimes the math around cap tables requires circulars around this. I have a whole explainer that talks deeply about like circular references and why they're typically bad in many scenarios, or why they're okay and often like required to do a lot of cap table calculations. But I tend to like these sheets themselves use circular references for them. And if you open up an Excel and it says there's a circular error, it's not an error, just enable error calculations and it works perfectly fine. It's a perfectly acceptable method to do that. And if you have questions about that, this is the circular reference thing goes into detail in terms of how to address that. I'm not sure if that answers the question in the chat. If the person wants to kind of come off and ask it again, I'm happy to address it more. But just as a note, like circular, it's some of the concepts around this can be a little hard to grok conceptually. And I think once you understand the idea of circular references and the idea to kind of deal with it, it's one way to address it. Go ahead, Diego. Feel free to ask.
Yeah, hey Taylor, thanks. I'm just a little confused around the math. So just to stress an example, say that we have an existing company with two investors, founder and investor A, no, each with 50% equity, right? But then investor A has anti-dilution rights. Then they issue a new equity round, but then investor B comes in, and to stress the example, he buys up 5 million, 5 million pre-money valuation. So he would be effectively buying up 50% of the company, no, in the pro rata, with the pro forma, sorry, cap table. So he'd be buying up 50%, but then prior to this investment, founder and investor A both have 50%. But if investor A has anti-dilution rights, which preserve his ownership percentage, which is at 50%, then I don't understand where that leaves the founder.
Yeah, I don't think the founder would do that. It's a simple thing that would do want to work.
Right.
I mean, you're basically saying it's not mathematically possible. I'm saying it's mathematically possible. It's just a really bad deal. I don't think it would work that way.
Yeah. It's a totally, let's say, stressed out example, but so it just goes around on the deal details, but that's how it would, let's say. And if they were to do that, let's say they run out of cash tomorrow, and investor A is not willing to let his investment die, but he's gonna, let's say, throw the founder under the bus. That's how it would work in that case.
I mean, mathematically, yes, but practically no, because they're not going to do the deal, which leaves the founder with zero ownership percentage. Like,
right.
Like from a mathematical perspective, yeah, but practically no. No one would actually ever do that deal.
Yeah.
And more likely, and if that was actually a scenario like that, you would actually do more like a recap, right? So instead of like going through a down round like that, you would choose to recapitalize the company, which basically wipes out existing investors and just say, well, all the old shares are worth nothing. Let's just create a new cap table for this company, which would be a more realistic way to approach something like that.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Taylor. Yeah.
No worries. Other questions? Feel free to raise your hand in Zoom, or you can leave in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions anybody has. Yeah, so the note in the chat basically says the thing to add, if you have founders get hit the most by anti-dilution, writes the notes, it's everyone in the common share class. It's actually all investors that don't have anti-dilution protection, most specifically. But that can include early investors. So whether they own common or preferred, right? You can own preferred that doesn't have anti-dilution protection, but like any shareholder that doesn't have any anti-dilution protection. As well as any stock options. Now the stock options is an important point there. So oftentimes, a lot of early employees will have stock options. Stock options basically is a way to provide the ability for employees to benefit from the value creation in the company. So they're given shares of the ownership of a company at a certain price from when they join. And, the idea is that it goes up in the future. Down rounds are really damaging for companies which have granted stock options at a certain strike price. So like say, hey, maybe the value of the company when you join the company is worth, you get stock options valued at five, maybe a strike price of $5 per share. And the company raises a down value, or raises a down round, and now the other shares are only worth $3. Well, that means your shares or your options are worth nothing, right? Can be a really, when we talk about like damaging things, that can be a really damaging thing for employees and totally disincentivize them from continuing work. Oftentimes companies will do things to address that, right? Issue new options at lower prices, reprice them existing options. They'll do things to address and deal with that. Of course, when they do that, that dilution still has to come from somewhere. Sometimes some of that dilution might be borne by investors because they may recognize the fact that, like, if you disincentivize all your employees, well, then nobody's going to do the work and the company's not worth anything. So like there can be a value to investor to creating options pools and bear some dilution from that to deal with that. But oftentimes it does come from other shareholders, specifically like founders, the ones that bear a lot of that dilution effect from it as well. That's a good point to add. Question around recording. So that was in the notes I sent out prior to class. So the recording, slides, spreadsheet, all stuff will go out afterwards and be available to watch online as well. That'll go out, I think, in either today or tomorrow. I don't know which one. Other questions? Go ahead, Diego.
Thanks, Taylor. Just one more question. It's regarding about these anti-dilution shares. In the case that in anti-dilution scenarios, and you do end up issuing new shares to cover for the loss of value and to compensate for that. Say that you issue the shares, but then the investor or some of the investors don't end up paying up the shares. They typically end up pricing those at 1 cent per share. No, typically just a reference value to say. So if the investors who did have the anti-dilution rights end up not covering or not paying up for those new issued shares, then the new investor makes the investment, but then those shares that were issued for anti-dilution provisions affect the number of fully outstanding shares. No.
Yeah.
So then they end up canceling that, but the investor B or the new investor already has made his investment. But then if that ends up impacting the value per share, if these prior investors don't end up covering their
Yeah, but it wouldn't work.
shares.
It wouldn't work like that though, right? So like that's a theoretical thing that wouldn't happen. So like I'm not going to give them shares they don't pay for it. Right. So like if the contractual agreement is you have to pay for those shares, I'll give them to you. I'm not going to give you the shares you don't pay for them. So the scenario of like I give you the shares, but you actually don't give me the money, that wouldn't actually happen. But you are correct that like when you issue new shares to them, they you are including them with those would be included in when you calculate the share price. So the new investor, because the new investor says, hey, if I'm going to buy 25% of the company, I want 25% of the company off the ground. I don't want to get diluted by the new shares being issued to the investors, the anti-dilution clause, right? So that's why in this example, right, the company, the way we calculate the share price, and this is kind of like, this is stuff that I do in other classes in terms of like how you calculate the share price in a transaction. This is like a thing I do like hours on in other classes. But the short part of it is like the way to calculate the share price so that the existing investor actually gets the ownership they expected, right? So like I'm putting in 2.5 on 8 million pre, I would expect to get 2.5 divided by 10.5, or what is that? 23, what? 23.1% of the company. We calculate out the share price such that at the end we calculate the number of shares issuing at their investment, so they get 23.8% of the company, right? So the method we use to calculate the share price does that. We include the number of shares being issued either through adjustment to conversion ratio, right? Not issuing shares, but like any shares are issued to deal with that, as well as the fully dilutive ownership, the fully dilutive number of shares. We also still include in that calculation of the share price. So that way, on an as converted basis, the investor actually gets the ownership percentage they expected. But if the investor doesn't pay, if the investor is supposed to pay for the shares, they don't, we wouldn't actually give them the shares.
Right. Oh,
Question.
I see. So yeah, so you would do it in two stages. No, so you clean up the cap table prior to the investment, which includes all of these modifications to include the anti-dilution shares. And then once you have that cleaned up cap table, you can then bring in the new investor. No, that would be the
It's all
easiest.
one stage. It's all done at the same time.
One stage. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? So if there's no other questions, just to recap, like if you have other questions around cap tables in general, I have a lot of tools and documents and things I've written about how to deal with cap tables and do calculations around it on my site. Also have a tool itself, which can be used to dualize calculations. So a lot of the anti-dilution that we covered now is actually embedded within the cap table tool. And then if you want to learn a lot more about this, a lot more detail, I do teach a series of classes around anti-dilution, but a lot more of the other concepts around cap tables. So, I know it's really interesting to me because like when I first started building like this cap table tool I did years ago, I started doing this, nobody ever asked about anti-dilution. And it was just not a typical thing people asked about because every round was up. Even though like I've worked around transactions through a couple of down cycles, but over the last couple of years, I got a lot more questions around anti-dilution, and so that's why I kind of really spent the time to refine, update the tool where it deals with a lot of the kind of common terms from them. So down rounds have been much more. I think the most recent Carta data showed like I think it was near like 20% of rounds last year were down rounds, and so it's become a lot more prevalent, and companies have been a lot more cognizant of the terms and how they impact things. So definitely something to learn and to pay attention to. And if you have any questions around this stuff anytime, I'm easy to contact, foresight.is. Also, just Taylor at foresight.is as well. Happy to help.